Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating analysis that takes a hard look at one of Christianity's most foundational and, let's be honest, most complex doctrines, the Trinity. So we're going to be looking at a textual critique of some popular explanations of the Trinity, specifically those by Wes Huff. Now, his presentations are really well known for being super clear and accessible, but the source material we're digging into today, well, it puts them to a very specific and very tough test. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to walk through this analysis in 5 steps. First, we'll get a handle on the popular explanation being examined. Then, we'll unpack the special tool the critique uses, this boundary of method. After that, we'll see how the explanation stacks up against it. And finally, we'll explore the alternative view the source puts on the table. Okay, first things first. To really get what this critique is all about, we have to understand exactly what it's critiquing. Let's look at the popular explanations at the heart of this. Now, one thing the source makes really clear right off the bat is that it's not knocking the clarity of Huff's work. It actually says his explanations are confident and rhetorically effective. They're a really solid introduction for a lot of people. But here's where the rubber meets the road. The analysis asks a bigger question. It's not just about whether an explanation is easy to follow. It's about whether it holds up when you apply a really strict, disciplined method of reading the Bible. So how does this analysis build its case? Well, it all hinges on this core concept, this analytical tool that it calls the boundary of method. This is really the engine driving the whole critique. So what in the world is this boundary of method? Okay, imagine you're a detective. You can only use evidence found at the crime scene. You can't bring in theories from other cases. This principle is the exact same idea, but for theology. It's a rule that says doctrine has to come out of the biblical text, not be forced onto it from the outside. And this method has some really strict rules of engagement, Doctrine has to flow directly from Scripture. You can't use philosophical ideas that came centuries later unless they were also part of a revelation. The idea is to let the text just speak for itself, without trying to make it fit a preconceived notion. Revelation gets the final say, not tradition. Okay, so this is where it gets really fascinating. The source takes this boundary of method framework and applies it point by point directly to Wes Huff's videos. And boom, here's the scorecard from the source itself. It just lays it all out, right? It's judging both videos against the very criteria we just talked about. And, well, you can see the results. According to this analysis, the explanations fall short on whether they're derived from primary revelation, whether they're logically clear, and whether they really grapple with the tough question. So what's the takeaway here? The analysis basically concludes that, look, these explanations are great for teaching the basics, what it calls popular catechesis. They get the job done for a general audience. But when you put them under this strict methodological microscope, the source argues they just don't hold up as rigorously disciplined theology. And all of this really brings us to the core tension the analysis wants to highlight. This apparent clash between the actual language you find in the Bible and the philosophical language that was used much, much later to explain doctrines like the Trinity. For example, the source zeroes in on a verse like John 17:3. It argues that here, in his own prayer, Jesus draws a very clear distinction between himself, the one whom thou hast sent, and his Father, who he calls the only true God.
And this slide really lays out the contrast, doesn't it? It's like two different vocabularies. On one side, you've got the Bible's language. It's relational, Father, Son, praying, obeying. On the other side, you've got these later philosophical terms, like ousia for essence and hypostases for persons. The source claims these terms were brought in to solve theological problems, but they're just not the language the Bible itself uses.
And this leads to a pretty wild claim in the text, a kind of paradox, really. It argues that the more detailed and theologically full an explanation of the Trinity gets, think Augustine or Aquinas, the less it actually sounds like the Bible, and the more it has to lean on these outside philosophical ideas. Okay, so after making its case and laying out the critique, the source doesn't just leave us hanging. It actually proposes an alternative way of looking at all of this. And this alternative isn't just presented as another interpretation. No, it's framed as something totally different. A framework built on the claim of new, direct revelation. The argument is that this approach lets you read the Bible plainly without needing philosophy to come in and rescue the text from its apparent contradictions. So the source sets up this direct comparison. You have Trinitarianism, which it says uses philosophy to resolve biblical tension. Then you have Restorationism, which it claims uses new revelation to do the same thing. One path, it says, ends in mystery, while the other pointing right back to John 17:3, ends with the idea that God can be known. And at the end of the day, it all comes back to this one single, uncompromising idea for this analysis. The source's whole argument is that revelation and revelation alone gets to define who God is. So this analysis leaves us with a pretty provocative question to chew on, and it's not just about this one doctrine. It's a question we can ask about any belief. If an idea seems to get clearer and make more sense the further you get from its original source, what does that tell you about where that idea really came from? Something to think about.